So what is stagflation? Well, in simple terms, it is where there is a persistent combination of stagnant demand, high unemployment, and high inflation in an economy. The shorthand for this combination is known as stagflation. The word itself is attributed to a British politician, Ian MacLeod, who said in a speech to Parliament on the 17th of November 1965 that we now have the worst of both worlds. Not just inflation on the one side or stagnation on the other, but both of them together. We have a sort of stagflation situation. Although first diagnosed in the mid-1960s, it wasn't until the 1970s that people really started to notice and worry about stagflation. Before then, there actually appeared to be a stable, long-term relationship between the level of unemployment and the level of inflation, a relationship that was known as the Phillips curve. High inflation meant low unemployment, and conversely, high unemployment meant low inflation. What you didn't get was high unemployment and high inflation. By the 1970s, though, this relationship had completely broken down. So what caused stagflation? Well, broadly, there are two main explanations, one supply-related and one demand-related. The supply shock explanation is the most well-known and, in the public's mind, the cause of stagflation. This view asserts that stagflation was a direct consequence of the 1973 oil crisis. From October 1973, a number of major oil-producing countries restricted the supply of oil, which, in turn, made energy much more expensive. This not only pushed up prices, but, as firms struggled to adapt to significantly higher energy costs, economic output reduced and unemployment rose. The result? Stagflation. This is known as a supply shock argument and occurs where there is a substantial change in the supply of a commodity central to the functioning of the economy. This in turn results in unforeseen changes in equilibrium prices and output. Although this is part of the story, the reality is that stagflation had started before the 1973 oil shock. Our second explanation looks at the level of demand in the economy. From the 1960s onwards, Western governments increasingly relied on loose fiscal and monetary policy to fund social programs, and in the case of the USA, an expensive foreign war in Vietnam. The role of monetary policy is often emphasized here, particularly after 1971, when the US abandoned the gold standard and had much more control over its own money supply. The argument is that too much money in the economy, chasing too few goods, led to rising prices and, crucially, revised public expectations about future levels of inflation. With high public expectations of inflation locked in, high inflation became a self-fulfilling prophecy. Inflation was high irrespective of the level of output and employment. The result? Stagflation. Ultimately, stagflation was overcome by the absence of significant supply-side shocks from 1974 onwards, and tighter control over monetary and fiscal policy in the late 1970s and early 1980s. The lessons, though, are clear. Unexpected events can have a huge impact on an economy, and that there are long-term consequences for governments tempted to run fast and loose with monetary and fiscal policy.